Hi everyone, this is Dr. Nicole Quinn and I'm here with Dr. Brenda Roud, co-host of the Immunology Podcast. Welcome to the Lab Coats in Life podcast, where we help scientists thrive. The Lab Coats in Life podcast is brought to you by STEMCELL Technologies, a global biotechnology company supporting life sciences research and fostering communication and collaboration in science. If you enjoy the Lab Coats in Life podcast, rate us and leave a review. You can also suggest ideas or recommend guests for new episodes. Today's episode covers a very cool topic, making an impact via social media. Our guest is Dr. Sara from the University of Utah on the podcast today to talk about her experience using social media to make an impact. Specializing in science and risk communication, Dr. Yo's research explores the intersection of science, media, and politics. Currently, she is interested in how emotions and humor affect the formation of public attitudes towards science and technology. But before we get to that, would you like to organize a journal club but aren't sure where to start? Visit www.stemcell.com/journal club to find free downloadable checklists and templates, including an attendance sheet, preparation checklist, presenter evaluation form template, and more.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Sara. I'm very excited about our conversation. As an avid user of social media, I am very interested in both the role of such media in transmitting science, in getting scientists on the conversation and getting them closer to the general public. But I also have learned that there's so much you can leverage from social media for your own career, for, getting yourself out there, being in touch with other scientists, with helping you find papers and projects of interest. So I think that's going to be a really, really nice conversation. So maybe Nicole can introduce a little bit about her experience with social media, because she also has a lot of it.
Yeah, I would say I'm not on social media as much as I should be, but I have been running the social media strategy at STEMCELL for a long time. And we have many, many channels, almost 45 different channels of science communication platforms and ways we share science information. And so I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated in the role that social media can play in helping scientists communicate not only the research, but also about themselves. So why don't you, Sara, start by telling us a bit about yourself and your background and how this became a topic of interest for you?
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Thanks, Brenda. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So I think I should maybe start by correcting a quick little thing. I'm on things like X, formerly known as Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't actually use social media that much. I have an Instagram account, which I almost never look at, even for cute cat videos. I just have other people look for cute cat videos and then show them to me. But I do study social media, and my graduate students help keep me up to date with the new sort of developments on whatever TikTok or Snapchat or whatever is going on. And so, my research is sort of squarely in social media, but I'll tell you a little bit about how I got here, because it's a bit of a circuitous route to science communication. I have an undergraduate degree in oceanography with a minor in chemistry. When I was an undergraduate student, I thought I was going to be a chemical oceanographer, actually. I thought I was going to study carbon cycling in the world's oceans. So I got that degree after sort of having a lot of fun in Hawaii. I lived in Honolulu for 8 years. And so I got my bachelor's degree there, and then I went to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I have a master's degree in oceanography. I turned into a microbial oceanographer, actually, studying bacterial community dynamics in the surface waters of marine ecosystems. And then I thought, well, I'm going to continue doing this research, and so I'm going to move to the University of Wisconsin at Madison. There I was in an environmental engineering PhD program. And did a lot, as some of us as graduate students did a lot of sort of public engagement and outreach, and couldn't really understand why nobody was as excited about microbes as I happened to be, or I thought they were really interesting, right? I would go to these events and I would have a whole booth set up about microbes, and then people would come by and we'd end up talking about recycling, which is great, but very far afield from what I'm studying, right? And so as part of the engineering professional development program at the University of Wisconsin, or at least it was a course with that designation, there was a science communication class, and that's how I got into science communication. I very quickly shifted my focus. So I went from an engineering PhD program to a science communication master's program. I thought it would be a terminal degree. I'd get a job as a science communicator somewhere. But I ended up really enjoying the research and went on to get my PhD. And so my dissertation sort of looks at the topic of nanotechnology. The topic itself is interesting and it provides context, but what my research area in my dissertation anyway, was about how we seek information about science and how we use various values, right, that we might hold to do that. And when I say we, I mean public audiences, not necessarily scientists. The way in which scientists seek information can be quite different from the way public audiences seek information, depending, of course, on their levels of expertise and awareness and familiarity and so on. And so, yeah, since then, from Wisconsin, I moved to Utah. And my research focus shifted a little bit from looking at things that are perhaps more common in political science, things like political ideology, partisan identity, to things like emotion, right? How we use emotion to make decisions, even about scientific topics. I think we like to think of science as kind of a cold and rational type of undertaking, and it is clearly not that, because it is a human endeavor, right? And as humans, we are imbued with emotions, and we make a lot of decisions actually based on kind of emotional decision making. From there, I went into thinking about, well, what I really want to do is think about how I might be able to help science communicators do their work better, right? With empirical evidence to that end. And so I quickly sort of shifted to thinking about what kinds of tactics we might use when we talk about various topics in science to either do things like, engender more trust, right, in the communicator, which is an important part of talking about of any communication. Or thinking about how we present scientific information might encourage engagement with them. And a lot of this research has taken place on social media, because that really is a very, very key part of our media diets today.
I love the story. I love the career path, because I think, on the bigger picture, what we're trying to help scientists with this podcast is showing that there are all different ways you can contribute to science, and there are all different paths that you can follow. And you really are an example of someone who followed their curiosity and what inspired them, and ended up really far from chemical oceanography to studying
Yeah.
emotion and in science communication, but still really contributing in a really cool way. So I'm fascinated to hear a little bit more about this research, and maybe this is such a big open-ended question, but what benefit has social media had for science? And I'll just sort of provide some context that I've been overseeing a social media marketing program, but really building social media communities with scientists for over a decade now. And I will say it's come so far. Like at the beginning, it was no, scientists don't want to be on social media. Social media was all about showing what you ate for lunch, and and there's no, scientists have no time or place for that. They
Right.
have better things to do. And of course, we've come in that decade very far. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a professional perspective on that versus my, armchair observations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also have armchair observations just from a science communication researcher perspective, but it kind of has been positive in many aspects, right? The rise of social media and how we use it as scientists. It's been great for scientists communicating with other scientists, right? Making connections. You can see for a while, a lot of the, for example, open science movement, right, and the discussions are happening on Twitter and talking about these papers and so on. There's obviously, I think, unintended consequences of that too, right? The idea that like someone you respect endorses this paper, and so you've sort of formed opinions about that particular journal article or news article based on what that person has said, right? They have contextualized that information. And that actually is part of the research in social media, is that the interactive part of it is quite new and quite novel to us in media, right? And so those cues, those sort of social cues that we get from the interactivity, really can affect how we think about that information. But so, it's been positive in that scientists are able to connect with other scientists. It's been positive for other groups as well. Journalists and scientists, for example, can form relationships over social media that enable and encourage better science reporting, perhaps, right? It's been great to some extent, potentially, for public audiences to also see behind the sort of curtain of science, right? Behind this kind of opaque curtain of science. And so thinking about, now I'm thinking about examples of hashtags on Twitter, like this is what a scientist looks like, right? We can think about how those types of things show scientists as not the stereotypical scientists, right? And if you haven't looked, the hashtag this is what a scientist looks like is usually a collection of photos, right, by scientists tagged with that particular hashtag that has an image of them, like normal, everyday humans doing scientific things, right? So kind of dispelling the myth of like the scientist is the white male in the lab coat.
Exactly. I was going to say the same thing about diversity. It shows women and people of all different backgrounds and all different types of science. I've seen that hashtag. I've seen, pictures of people out like in the tundra digging up something, or like, doing field research in an ecology discipline, and then people culturing cells in the lab, and people, like, it sort of shows all these different things you can do with a scientific career, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also really great sort of, I think there's something to be said about how it might open the doors to like people viewing the process of science a little bit. If you've ever seen the hashtag fieldwork fail or overly honest methods, and these are funny hashtags, right? These are humorous, satirical hashtags specifically about the process and the enterprise of science. That when we learn about science, I didn't go to school in the US, so I actually have no sense of when we learn about science in the US. Anyway, when we learn about science as kids, right? We learn about it as a very clean, neat, everything in its place kind of process, right? The reality of doing science, as we know, is not that way. And so, this is a more realistic human view, right, of this thing that we think of as sort of cold and rational, but it is a human endeavor, and so it is imbued with all the kind of human flaws, you might say. It's really more like characteristics.
So I think you quite well established that social media and the rise in the usage of social media really helps or has helped science become a little bit closer to everyday life, to connect researchers and scientists with the general public. So far, kind of in a more global view. But then, if I may, if we're thinking of the individual, like a scientist that is interested, is wondering what is social media has to offer, the career, both maybe, I think there's, the way I see it, there's like two different reasons you would use as an individual. You would use social media. You, on the one hand, similar, the same lines of what we were speaking about, having the opportunity of reaching out because you have an interest in reaching with your science and in a way become involved in the discourse, globally, regionally, nationally. And on the other hand, the idea that you can use this as a way to advance your career, to improve your network, to become more knowledgeable, or the quote unquote thought leaders in your area. So maybe, do you think we could maybe talk a little bit about me as a scientist? What do I have to gain? Why would it be important for me to try to adopt communication, this kind of social media in my everyday life?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think what you're talking about is both intrinsic advantages or intrinsic pros of using something, as well as extrinsic ones, right? On the one hand, there are intrinsic sort of drivers of why we might use social media, in that we, some of us might feel some sort of obligation. A lot of our funding, for example, comes from public sources, right? And so there has to be something, or at least, I mean, it doesn't have to be necessary, but often we feel like there might be something that we could give back to communities that have funded this type of research, right? So there's intrinsic motivations such as that. There's sort of the idea that, for example, I believe science is the best way we come to know something, and I would love to see more science implemented in various policies that we make, right, as society. And so that is one of the drivers of kind of why we might communicate. There are sort of extrinsic advantages, like you alluded to. So becoming more known in your network, right? Having connections online can often lead to like connections in person, right? Thought leaders in your field connecting at various conferences. There's also, I think, something about if you have something interesting and there's a journalist on Twitter, right? There might be more publicity for your work. Especially if you think that work is important. And so I think as an individual scientist, there are various drivers, but there should be also recognition, I think, of the costs of communicating, right? It is not something that we necessarily get paid for example. It is not something that is necessarily rewarded, although that is something structural that I think as science, we should think about how we reward public engagement and public communication, right? The reason we do a lot of this research is to have some impact in society, presumably, even for basic science, right? For example, you can think about the development of vaccines. Without basic science, we would never have got to a vaccine as quickly as we did for COVID, right? And so, yeah, I think there should be a recognition that there are costs associated with this, and that one thing that we can all do a better job on is having structures that support scientists to do this kind of public engagement or public communication if we value it, right? I personally value it and would love to see more institutional structures that support individual scientists doing this. But, this is sort of one of the big challenges in science communication right now. Where are the structures that support scientists and other communicators to talk about science and impacts of research in society? And how do science communicators get to that particular career? There's really not a very good professionalization or a very clear professionalization route to becoming a science communicator. Right. I feel like my journey to science communication, and this is very specific, this is a very academic science communication researcher journey. It is even more convoluted for a lot of folks who become practitioners in science communication. Right. For example, I know many practitioners who have a PhD in, biophysics or something, and they work as a science communicator because it was a degree that they got after their PhD. They were interested in this, or they've just started doing it, right? Found they were good at it and continued doing this as a career. But almost every science communicator I have spoken to has a different route to their current career. And that is a big challenge for science communication as a field, because we have not a very good, clear route to professionalization, right? And so when graduate students come up and say, I would like to do this as my career, it's a little, I feel bad about saying, great, good luck.
Figure it out. Yes.
Right, I know. And it's because it's hard to point, right? So I could say, for example, you could be a science communication researcher. I have a very clear path for you to do that. Right. But to gain the skills that one needs to be versed in science and to be versed in the practice of communication, that is still a challenge.
Yeah, I hear you. I can do the same thing if somebody wants to go into science communication as a marketer, to be in marketing. I think you touched on two really important things. And one is that scientists are not paid to do this or necessarily rewarded to do this. And I think I've heard little inklings of that changing, where maybe some tenure track, or tenure evaluations are looking at how well somebody or someone's contribution to science communication. I don't think it's widespread at this point, but there's a little bit more openness to it. And I agree. I would love to see that spread a bit. And then the second point is that we don't, as scientists, receive any training in this. And you spoke to to the root of becoming a full-time science communicator as a scientist. But I think there's also this, there's a lot of active researchers, scientists out there who are devoting some of their time as to be communicators on social media. But they're figuring it out for themselves. So I'm wondering if we can do a very quick how-to basics, like what platforms are people on? What should people start with? How do they avoid pitfalls? And one of the pitfalls that, like, social media is built to be addictive. So like, how do we balance this, and how do we, I don't know. Do you have some tips?
Yeah, I think, the how-to tips are getting ever more challenging because the platforms change so quickly, right? I think a couple of months ago, I would have probably said Twitter is a good place to be. Maybe more like a year ago, I would have said Twitter X is a good place to be, right? But what you see now is, and this is anecdotal. We don't have any data on this necessarily, but a friend of mine who's a scientist and also a cartoon artist used to post a lot of things on Twitter. He would draw comics about science, right? And sort of anecdotally, he said he's seen less traction on that platform. And so the question of where we might go really depends on sort of what audience you are thinking of attracting, or what audience you're posting something for, right? Think, for example, of the difference between Facebook and what used to be Twitter. I think at some point most of us considered one of those more personal and one of those more professional. And I think that's probably still the case, that Facebook tends to be more of a personal social media that one uses for personal reasons. But LinkedIn, for example, I've seen a lot more posts on LinkedIn that one might perhaps see on Twitter instead. And I feel like that maybe is moving to that platform. And then depending on the other audiences that you want to connect with, right? And that might depend on what your research is about, where those audiences are, right? So younger audiences, things like Instagram, TikTok, right? And sort of what are you putting out there? How short are they? And this is why I say all these considerations, right? You got to know something about your audience. You have to have an objective in mind, right? For your communications, you have to design your communication to that objective. I'm sorry, none of this is like a good here's 3 steps to get started. But this is sort of epitomizes how challenging and that it is something that is worth considering and thinking deeply about, right, for communication. And certainly there are many times where we're just like, look, I just published this paper, post that, right? And we get some traction on it. That's great. But again, these sorts of support that is needed for communication is really something that I've been thinking more about recently, right? How do we do that? And then again, with the rewards for these kinds of things. And I'm not saying that public engagement or public communication should be the only reward. Of course not. There's many ways, right? But maybe it can count as something, perhaps, because it does take time to be a public intellectual, and it's varying degrees of being a public intellectual, right? At this point with social media, no longer is it that you just write op-eds for the New York Times or the Washington Post. Now you can be a public intellectual on social media and be sort of a self-publishing public individual.
I just want to say that my experience, I mean, I am a little bit of a lurker in social media. I am not a regular poster. I find it I have to admit, although I put myself out there every other week, recording the Immunology podcast, to be honest, when it comes to social media and opening up in social media, I don't do that. It is really hard. I find it like the time, of course, is a situation, is a factor, but also to some extent, the openness and the exposure, it can be a little bit intimidating. So I'm more of a lurker. I stalk other accounts, and actually have found it extremely useful for me, for my career, both on my work at the podcast and my work in my own research, because my strategy so far has been to just follow everybody that has something interesting to say. So those people that, do have the courage to put their thoughts out there, those people that share papers or are really good at reposting papers or news or opinions from other people. So like, I just basically follow all of the journals, all of the major research institutes I like, I follow many of the most of the PIs that work in my field that are active in Twitter. And that has been so useful for me for finding the latest research. People not only do they post a link to their recently published paper or even their preprint. Also, preprint servers have all of them have automatic Twitter notifications, and I love also the tutorial, or as somebody said, the explainer version. So people actually take the time to, in a bunch of posts, explain their paper, and it already gives you an idea of what you're going for. So in that sense, as a tool to grow, and for me, it has been so good. So you don't even have to be a communicator or necessarily want to be the author of the discussion, but also as a spectator. I find it very nice. However, as you mentioned, I do think that lately my feed has been flooded by accounts just posting fun facts and animal pictures, and then I guess they get paid by the view or things like that. And I think those kind of incentives have flooded the attention in my feed lately, which is yeah. But I guess that's something they can fix by trying to only looking at posts of people you follow, but then you're missing out on new people you might actually be interested in following.
Yeah. And I think you're right. A lot of people are mostly lurkers on Twitter. That's certainly true for a lot of cases. I would maybe also consider, so you mentioned something that you follow accounts that you like, perhaps, right? I always wonder about, like, what about the things you don't necessarily like? 'Cause on my Twitter feed, for example, I follow media organizations from both sides of the American political aisle, right? Just because I'm curious to see what others say. And I do recognize that given my own biases, I will rationalize that information in some way for myself, right? So I see this as coming from an organization that I maybe disagree with, and I'm very good at rationalizing it to fit my own worldview. But yeah, I do think you're right that a lot of people are lurkers. And this is, I think, going to be generally true, right? That there are more of us who are lurkers than there are public intellectuals or public communicators. And that might be fine too. I don't think every scientist should be a communicator necessarily. We all know, right, that some of us maybe went into this profession because we prefer to be in a lab or behind a computer instead of in front of a microphone or standing on a stage or right. And that's okay. And this is why I think those, I'm going to come back to this again, but those support structures are really important because the scientist doesn't necessarily have to do it by themselves. They don't necessarily have to be the face in front of that communication, right? There can be others that support that as well.
I have a question, a multifaceted question, as I usually do, because you spoke about how you follow people who and accounts that you don't necessarily agree with or don't necessarily side with politically or whatever, and I do the same. And my question is about your personal brand on Twitter or wherever, your personal brand wherever. I'm nervous about my professional brand. I'm nervous about people seeing that I'm following whatever it is that is controversial or and like, oh, is that where she sits? Is that where? And it's no, I just want to be informed. I just want to know what everyone's saying and what's happening out there in the world. So there's that's a piece of the question is, should people consider that? Is that a silly thing to think about? And then the second kind of broader thing is should people have a persona, like a professional persona and a personal persona, and separate those, maybe it's two different accounts. And maybe in there you can inject some of that, like, because I'm so fascinated by your research into humor.
I think that second question works really well for interjecting humor in there. But the idea of having sort of this professional and then also personal accounts, right? Some of us, I think, maybe have that. But I one of the things that anecdotally you hear a lot about scientists is that we are not particularly warm and friendly and likable and human, right? And so I always wonder, like, social media is one of those things where you can like project a persona of yourself that you get to curate, and so it can be professional, but it can also be a very human sort of persona online. But I also think that we are whole human beings. Scientists are whole human beings, and like to deny that idea by separating, and one aspect of this is separating personal and professional, right? Is maybe not always a good thing. It can have like detrimental consequences. And so I also think that for like people looking at scientists, right? If I can see you as a public scientist, I also know that, well, you like cats, or right, you are an approachable, warm, likable human being behind the like science persona, right? So I think I think there are some people who have to separate that for various reasons. So, for example, if you have a federal science job, for example, that you may not, right? There are rules around what you can post and what you can't post as that. I mean, there are rules as a university professor about how you advocate as an individual or how you advocate as a representative of the university and the institution. And so, there's some rules around that are linked to our employment, right? But I think as a scientist, I sort of want to be seen also as like a human being, right? And for the most part, I do think that a lot of scientists' Twitter accounts also contain things like, I'm a birder, or I go I go biking or hiking, things like this. Yeah, and I think that can make them more approachable. Humor, and this is where this comes in, is one of the other things I think that makes scientists more approachable, more likable, more warm. And we know that, more likable communicators tend to be more trusted communicators, right? And so, but it does matter kind of the types of humor that one might use. A lot of the work that we see, a lot of the humor in science that we see on social media, at least on Twitter, X, Instagram, and Instagram, are quite satirical. But there's also a lot of instances of wordplay, which are puns around science. So a good example is if you can imagine a cell holding a cell phone, taking a selfie.
Very meta.
Right,
Yep.
very meta. And so that's wordplay, but that's also an example of another type of humor, which is anthropomorphism. I've given a cell human-like, imbued it with human-like characteristics, and that is a technique of making people laugh as well, right? You can imagine how amusing we find animals that are saying things or that do human-like things. Humor is not as funny when you have to explain it like this, right? So I struggle with that. But yeah, and then I think the other question was about if I'm worried about who I'm following as a persona. I think, in a lot of cases, in my case, for example, I'm a media scholar. I study media effects. I'm in communication. I think people might judge me less for following media organizations that I don't agree with necessarily, right? But also on the other hand, I'm sort of like, well, I don't actually think anyone thinks I'm important enough to go through who I'm you know what I mean? Like I'm not sure that any single thing I do is important enough to warrant that. I'm sure there are some people who do have that, right? Who are important enough that maybe they're concerned about that. But on the other hand, I also think it's just nice to be transparent about who I'm following. And if you get asked, there's an easy answer, right, to that. I follow that because I want to stay informed. I want different perspectives. And I think that sort of having different perspectives, hearing different perspectives, engaging with different perspectives. I mean, this is a big part of why we get a liberal arts education, right? This is a big part of how dialogue and discourse in society is fostered. And so I think it's actually quite detrimental if we just kind of silo ourselves to our preferred sides.
Absolutely. And I just want to make a point on the rules that you said, there's rules for federal employees, there's rules for university employees, there's also rules for employees of companies. And that those rules tend to be around things, well, maybe there's around confidentiality and stuff like that, but also around just decorum, not bad mouthing anyone, not being abusive, not being aggressive, whatever. And those things you can't get around by separating a personal and private persona or account on social media. You are who you are. And if you're going to be bullying on social media, that's probably going to impact a professional career, regardless of who your employer is.
So another thing, I'm being very practical here because I'm taking notes. I also, another thing that I think about sometimes about being a persona on social media, trying to be a public intellectual. Is, the downsides. There are downsides. Of course, it can be very rewarding, getting your voice out there, and benefiting from it in various ways. But also, on the one hand, I think there's the downside of the time, and I think we already kind of talked about this, the amount of effort that it takes, and the fact that whatever is out in the internet is there forever. So you have to be very mindful of things that might look good now, might not age well. And on the other hand, the very real risk of getting yourself in some strange situation, in some undesirable position, that it because of your valid views. And I think this is, as an immunologist, I've seen it a lot in the whole vaccine debate, and the non-existent controversy that for some reason exists, and actually the risks that people in this public personas go through, and actually normal scientists like you and me that initially all they did was share the latest updated data about vaccines for the public good, and then find themselves in a very delicate situation. So what do you think, what is the consequence of that? Are we missing good people, or can I protect myself of that? Is there anything we can do to reduce this impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at the vaccine challenge, issue, controversy that we want to talk about, same with you. I'm sort of like, I'm not sure why this is a controversy, but it is, right? I do think that, there's the possibility of controversy with all things that we communicate. Right? I do think that, I mean, unless you're Anthony Fauci, right, that the consequences are probably, they can be high. I'm not trivializing them. They can be emotionally and mentally high. But we also have the option of turning these things off, right? And I'm a huge advocate of just like taking a quick break from your social media, because there's plenty of research that shows that it's, not always the best thing for your mental health, especially, for example, in adolescence, right? But and so, I mean, but you can imagine that there are people out there who are putting themselves in front of public audiences in high profile cases, right? Defending their science and so on. And so I think there's going to be potential consequences, right? And these are just some of the things that we, in any case, scientists or not, being on social media has potential consequences. You may not even tweet about something or write about something scientific, and that could still have potential consequences, right? And so these are just kind of the things that go along with being on social media. I don't really have a good answer to that, right? But again, if I sort of believe that there's a reason that I want to be communicating in some way, I'm gonna mostly try to be a decent human being and doing it in a respectful way, and in a way that isn't necessarily partisan, but is also true to the science that I'm trying to share, right? Which sounds to me a little bit like hiding behind the science, but science is about empirical evidence, and just like the science communication research that we do is about empirical evidence, right? Best ways around communicating this. I'm going to share that. That's much less controversial because I'm not trying to get someone to take a vaccine or whatever, vote a certain way to mitigate climate or anything like this, right? So you can see how those things might be less controversial. But there's always risk that someone is going to disagree with me, right? And I think as scientists, we have a huge concern, some of us more than others. I think it does depend on who you are, around, well, who's going to attack me for this paper of mine that I've just put out on social media? Who's going to come back with like, well, you didn't do X, Y, and Z, right? And that's true, but for the most part, you've already addressed all these comments because it's been through, for example, a review process. And if not, I think some of that criticism, what I have control over is how I take that criticism and how I take and what I do with that. And so things like, those kinds of attacks might just be, well, actually, maybe I should think about this and change that in some way. right? And I don't mean to trivialize sort of the anxieties and the difficulties that people have when they're bullied online, because those things are real. Um, but as a scientist, I do think that if you are choosing to be on social media, there's always a possibility of that.
I think it loops back to some of the benefits. It's a cost benefit thing, right? We talked so much about benefits at the beginning, um, and the benefits not only to your individual career, but and notoriety or whatever
Mm-hmm.
exposure as a scientist, but also the benefits to science overall. And I think if and I agree with you, there's no perfect answer to this question, but a thing that we should all think about: science changes over time, and we need to show the world that that's that iterative process and that ongoing dialogue and the feedback from other scientists and other people. That's how we study. Peer reviews is there for a reason. We want to hear from our peers, and it's how, as you very eloquently said, how you receive that and how you respond to that feedback. And when you make the decision to disengage, this is no longer a productive conversation, I'm going to disengage from this, is really important. So learning to have your own decorum, and I'm speaking completely from observing other people doing this well, because like I said, I sit in Brenda's camp. I'm very much a lurker, and I watch and learn from social media, but I'm not on it as much as and I'm not active as much as I maybe should be.
Yeah, I do think there was another question in there around like the context. Like, what if something you put out there that'll be on the internet forever, whatever forever means, right? As long as you pay your subscription to whatever service. Like, what happens with time, right? Does it age well, for example? But I do think everything is quite context specific. I mean, we look back at the history of science in our various disciplines and the way that it was done. The technological advances, right, make some of these old seminal studies obsolete, for example, because there's just so much more technology now that you could use to do the science. And I think this is true for almost any field, right? That a lot of the breakthrough advances that happened, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades ago, you'd read them now because they're important papers, but you would never do that the same way. If you had to replicate the study, you wouldn't do that the same way, simply because the technology is so much more advanced, perhaps, right? And so I do think things have sort of a contextual time and place, and it's probably important to recognize that too, right? So I think about so I have a podcast, Planet SciComm, and we talk about science communication just sort of generally. And then will that have longevity? I'm probably not when, in an ideal world, whatever, 10 years down the line, all scientists are communicating about their research and we're doing a great job of it, right? Or there's a professional path to science communication, for example, right? That makes some of the things we've talked about on the podcast obsolete, but again, within the context of that time and space, it's relevant.
Absolutely. Sara, thank you so much for your time. I want to give you the opportunity to give us some closing remarks. Anything, any tips for our listeners, any sage advice, anything we didn't cover that you were hoping to kind of get out into the world?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all. I think what I do want to talk about is a little bit of like training for scientists that can be important, right, in terms of public communication and engagement and the various ways in which we engage. And so, there are so this is just a shameless plug. There's a training program, for example, the STEM Ambassador program that I direct, where we train scientists to engage with audiences based on their other identities, right? So as scientists, we are human, we live in society, and we have various hobbies, we have, various communities that we engage with in society that we might separate from our science. And what the STEM Ambassador program does is we try to encourage scientists to leverage these other identities and communities to share their research and share their science. So training is an important part of it, but I also think that, as a science communication researcher, I'm very excited about kind of where science communication is going and sort of the recognition that it's becoming more important, right? So podcasts like this are relatively new, I would say, talking and communicating, right, about research in particular disciplines. But we've seen quite a big growth in science communication, and I hope this continues because I think it's becoming more apparent, right, that like implementing or encouraging impacts of science and scientific research in society is critical.
And it helps science move faster, which we all need. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Sara. That brings us to the end of our show. Don't forget to sign up for our email list at www.labcoatsandlifepodcast.com to get show notes, episode summaries, and links to useful information, or learn more about STEM mentorship via the resources found at www.stemcell.com/labcoatsandlife. You can also reach out to us on X via STEMCELL at STEMCELL Tech or by email at info@labcoatsandlifepodcast.com with feedback or to suggest guests.